Hello and bonjour. You are watching Power Dilemmas here with Sarah Bokhari. It's been a month that elections Canada 2015 happened. In the meanwhile, the world was shook by terror attacks on Paris. ISIS laid a terrible blow to the world, particularly the West, after 9/11. ISIS ideology has not even killed the Muslims living in the Middle East or anyone who does not conform to their kind of ideology. And now it looks like nothing is safe. They can hit anywhere in the world, particularly the West. This act of war by ISIS has dawned upon all of us that the killing of ISIS is not only confined to Middle East and the Muslims living in the Middle East, but anyone who does not conform with them, they will kill them. And it shows that they can hit anywhere in the world, and particularly the West. The previous government of Stephen Harper sent fighter warplanes to this area to ward off ISIS and to curtail the menace of ISIS. However, Prime Minister Justin Trudeau promised on his campaign trail that Canada will create a softer image in world politics, and he will call back these warplanes from that war zone of Syria. Let's see how Canada is going to play a newer role in world politics, because we are seeing things coming from Justin Trudeau that they will be calling back these warplanes, these fighter warplanes from ISIS, and Canada will be taking a newer role in this mission in Syria, particularly curtailing ISIS. So as answering these questions and a few other, we are very happy to have with us a long-time political strategist, Mr. John Spink, here today with us at TAG TV. And John, welcome to my show, Power Dilemmas.
Thank you.
With Sarah Bokhari here at TAG TV. Let me give you a little introduction. John Spink has been a long-time political strategist. He has worked with people like Janet Ecker and Joe Oliver, and he believes he has been in this game. He's a student in this political game. So my first question would be to ask you, John, why is Justin Trudeau not ready to send these warplanes to ISIS?
Well, I think you hit on it when you commented that he made a commitment during the campaign, and I think he's painted himself into a corner. When the subject first came up about Canada participating in a military way, if you can remember at the time that Trudeau rather derisively talked about whipping out our F-18s, and from the beginning he really did downplay the need for that type of a mission. And it differentiated him from Prime Minister Harper on that subject. And since then, we've had other events happen, like as you indicate, the bombing of the Russian airliner. We've had attacks in Beirut, in Paris, and so on. I think that he's now in a very awkward position because the interim leader of the Conservative Party, Rona Ambrose, immediately called on the government to reconsider that commitment. And I think that from a political point of view, it makes him look bad, I think, to his supporters to now immediately do an about-face and change the position that he's argued for the last year and a bit. The problem is that Trudeau talked about our traditional role as peacekeepers, which was certainly the case when his father was Prime Minister. But the problem is that we're nowhere near the point where we can talk about peacekeeping. I used a metaphor in a blog that I wrote that we're sort of at the emergency room triage stage of this. We're not in a position to start talking about long-term care solutions. So I think that he has I think he's put himself in a very awkward position. Now, having said that, the current mission was authorized by the government through to the end of March of 2016, which is 4 months away. I would be very surprised if he pulls those warplanes back before then. I think that if he just lets the current mandate expire in March, a lot can happen in 4 months. And then I think it gives him a little more wiggle room in terms of whether he does change his mind and decide to renew that type of military option, or whether he does what he's now saying he will, which is basically to provide additional training and to step up humanitarian aid, which we've already seen does not work in that situation.
I enjoy reading your blog, which is called View from Below, and I will tell all my viewers to read a very interesting blog by John Spink called View from Below. So let's move the talk forward. You know, Canada is part of NATO. And if Canada does not participate with its allies like France and other countries, what's going to happen? How is the international community going to see Canada?
Well, so far, France has not invoked Article 5 of the NATO treaty, which would basically call on all member states to come to the aid of another NATO member who has been attacked by an external force, which I think everyone agrees is the case in this particular situation. France has gone to the European community and invoked their requirement to assist France, especially in security issues, but they have not gone to NATO and invoked Article 5. If they did, then Canada really has no choice but to assist in the fight against ISIS. However, I don't believe that the NATO treaty specifically says it has to take the form of military action. So I think that if he says that we're going to step up training of Kurdish rebels, we're going to provide additional humanitarian aid, whether it's drugs, food, whatever, I think technically within the letter of the treaty, he's probably okay on that. Mm-hmm. But I think most Canadians don't agree that that's sufficient with what we've seen, especially in the last couple of weeks.
Okay. As I said earlier, that France has termed ISIS attack as an act of war. Whose war is it anyway?
Well, even the Pope said this is part of World War III. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So whose war is it? Who are the combatants we're looking at?
I think that that's the problem. I think that too many people see this as almost like a civil war in the Middle East. And therein lies a major problem, because it is obviously far more than that. When you look at the indiscriminate attacks on civilians, Paris is obviously the most recent, but there's been lots of cases in the Middle East, most recently in Beirut, but various places where this type of bombing and indiscriminate killing has occurred. This is a war between a certain perverted ideology and people that really do believe in peace and freedom and so on. And the analogy that it's actually, you're hearing it more with analysts on TV and on radio, but I fully subscribe to it. This is not dissimilar to what happened in the late 30s. When Hitler slowly started to move across Europe, moving into the Rhineland, the Sudetenland, annexing Austria, moving into Czechoslovakia, there was an opportunity there to stop him. I mean, he admitted to his own advisors that it was a huge gamble on his part, that if Britain and France and the United States had said, no, you're not doing that and we're going to step in and stop you, that would have been it. But he called their bluff, and as a result, he was able to gain strength, gain territory, and we all know what ended up happening. I think that we're at the point now, if we don't stop ISIS now while we have a chance, this could get far, far worse. Today, ISIS have released videos saying that the next target is New York. They've also threatened Britain, Washington, and we're certainly not immune. Despite what Mr. Trudeau might think, this country is very much at risk, and we have been singled out in previous ISIS messages. Mm-hmm. So,
are people regretting not voting for Stephen Harper at this time?
You see, I wouldn't go so far on that, because people were ready for a change. We've talked about this on a personal level, that there was a mood to get rid of Stephen Harper, and I have said that I think he stayed too long. I think that if he had stepped down a couple of years earlier, the party had an opportunity to elect a new leader, to rejuvenate itself. I think the results might have been quite different, because certainly what you heard at the door wasn't how bad this government had performed, but it was rather they didn't like Stephen Harper's style, or at least his perceived style, and they felt it was time for a change. How often did our military commitment in the Middle East come up at the door? I can honestly tell you, in the 3 months of the campaign, I think I heard it once. It wasn't a big issue at the door. I think that the primary motivation for voters was they felt it was time to get rid of Harper, and they didn't like the communication strategy that the campaign had employed. I think that the average Canadian probably would support continuing our military mission. I think it's disgraceful, really, that we would walk away from that, especially right now, when other countries are starting to ramp up more and believe that this threat has to be stopped before it goes any further. But I don't think that people are necessarily equating the two and that they would have voted differently. I don't think so.
Going back to the campaign now, because we're still dissecting it, it's only been a month. How far do you think the Conservative campaign was divisive and it was creating fear-mongering and stuff?
Well, I mean, you can talk about the niqab issue, but I don't think that really made much difference one way or the other. I think that the Liberals perhaps used it to say that we were being divisive and so on. I think it was probably an issue in Quebec, and I think it definitely hurt Tom Mulcair and the NDP. But I honestly don't believe it was a significant issue in the rest of the country. Where I think that we really turned off voters was with the whole communication strategy, where we talked about Justin, with the fake job going application. They're saying he's just not ready, and he's got nice hair and so on and so forth. I think people tired of that very, very quickly. And it wasn't just something that was done back in the early periods in May or even into June to try to position him as an inexperienced leader of the Liberal Party, but rather we kept it up right up until the night before the election. So it wasn't so much why the Conservatives had done a good job in government or why Stephen Harper was a competent prime minister. Everything was Justin wasn't ready, and I think that backfired. I think, if anything, it drove people to Justin Trudeau. But I don't think it was I don't think that the Conservative campaign deliberately set out to divide the country. I don't think that was the case at all.
Okay, moving forward, and again, going back and thinking, the base, Conservative base, was the major, source of the votes for the Conservative Party. Why was the Conservative Party lack the capability to get new votes?
Well, I think part of the problem, and I've argued this with a lot of friends of mine, Conservatives, we have one failing, and that is that we think that everybody sees the world the same as we do. And that being that so long as you cut taxes, all the problems in the world will go away. And it's just not that simple. But if you look at this campaign, what we talked about over and over again was lower taxes, cutting the taxes, and so on and so forth. Not that that's not important, but there's so many more things to it. Environics did a very detailed study a couple of years ago, and it was comparing the views of various ethnic communities with Canadian, sort of Canadian-born voters, and their views on things like, would you rather see a reduction in taxes, and then you're responsible for some of your own health care by purchasing private plans or whatever? And it was like 2/3 of the respondents, whether they were Canadian-born or whether they were from ethnic groups, said no. In fact, I'd be willing to pay more taxes to ensure that I have quality health care when it's needed. And the same thing basically came up on the education issue. And I know technically those are provincial issues, but I think what it means is that people don't see the world only as a one-dimensional issue of higher taxes versus lower tax. It's far more complex. And I think that we assume that taxes is the only thing that they're concerned about. And that's not the case. So our base is probably somewhere around 30%. I mean, since the parties merged, even when Paul Martin was Prime Minister, we've never really gone below 29-30%. And I think that that's pretty well a solid number. But you can't form government there. That additional 7 or 8%, you have to appeal to those people in the middle, that they don't subscribe to ideology. They don't consider themselves to be conservative or liberal or right-wing or left-wing. They're just trying to raise a family, and they're just trying to pay the bills and plan for their retirement and make sure that their families are healthy. And those are the people that you have to bring on side, whether it's us or whether it's the Liberals or the NDP. If you don't appeal to those people in the middle that don't really associate with any political party, you can't win government. And we have been appealing to our base and not going after those other people.
A lot of people are saying that it's Justin Trudeau's Rockstar image which got him the vote. Okay, Ms. It's agreeable because he was in Manila and girls were drooling over him and they're like, he's the best looking guy ever. What do you think, or who do you think in the Conservative Party can bring that rock star image?
Well, let me just back up for a second. I think you're right about the impression or the image which Justin Trudeau has projected. But he comes by it honestly, because that's exactly what it was with his father. And I have to admit, when I was in the late 60s, early 70s, when I was going to university, I got caught up on that whole Trudeau mania thing, the same as a lot of people did. And he was different, he was cool, he hung out in discotheques in Yorkville and all these things. And a lot of people voted for him because of the image that he projected, versus Bob Stanfield, who was sort of, solid, true blue, but never going to excite a crowd. And I think Justin, it's part of his DNA. I must tell you a funny little story that during those misguided years when I considered myself to be a Trudeau liberal, I got invited to an event in which Pierre Trudeau was speaking, and we were allowed to bring a guest. So this young lady that hadn't been seeing her very often, but I was dating her, if you like, and we went to this thing together, and she happened to be fluently bilingual in French, and I was dancing with her, and I got a tap on the shoulder, and it was Pierre, and he cut in. And immediately started talking to her in French, and the two of them conversed, and I never saw her again that day. That was it, lost her for the evening. But young people were very drawn to him, and it's no different with Justin. I don't see anybody on the Conservative side that fits the image of Rockstar, but I'm not sure that's necessarily a bad thing. That's not who we are. We try to project an image of competence and, good fiscal managers and so on. I think there's ways of doing that where you don't turn people off, but I don't see a Conservative rock star on the scene right now. I really don't.
Okay, no, it was good to hear your story. So now that the world has been struck by a terror attack again, the numbers who sacrificed their lives is 127. We are in a new normal. Where do you think we are going to head as a country, Canada?
Well, I hate to hear you say the new normal, but I'm afraid you're probably right. Certainly in the last few years, we've seen stepped up security, whether it's when you're traveling, what you have to go through at airports, body scans, take off your shoes, take off your belts, and all this kind of stuff. The fact that you now have to have a passport even to go from Canada into the United States, which was never, ever a requirement before. I see these things in a cumulative way, and I see, if anything, they're going to get, more so. And I think it's unfortunately, it's just a sign of the times. As long as you've got threats like ISIS, that it can be, somebody living in the house next to you, it can be somebody that's across the hall from you in the grocery store, you have to take some precautions. And there isn't a country in the world that has security forces that they can constantly monitor everybody that has somehow shown up on a watch list. We've seen that in France. I mean, some of these people, had been under surveillance by the French authorities, but it's impossible. There's just too many people like that. So when you're in that type of a situation, you just have to increase vigilance. I mean, you see it now with more cameras on the streets. You go to a Blue Jays game and women have to open their purses and, sometimes even going through x-ray machines. I think that's here to stay. And if anything, I can see it getting worse unless something happens to change the road that we're on.
So you have seen everything. You've been into politics for a long time, and you've been analyzing it, strategizing. How did you develop a taste for politics, John?
Well, when I was a kid, I mean, it was just something that I found really interesting. I mean, the first episode that I actually remember was in 1958, and I was 10 years old, and John Diefenbaker was the head of a minority government in Canada, and he was trying for a majority. And my father had always been a supporter of, well, in those days it was the CCF, and that became the NDP, but he was a staunch union man, and he always voted for them. And I guess I had seen Diefenbaker on TV, and I kept saying to him, you should vote for him and all the rest of this stuff. And I walked with him to the poll, and polls in those days were usually in somebody's living room or front hallway, and it would just be one poll, not like today where you have 8 or 10 of them in a high school gymnasium. So anyway, we went to this house. My father goes in, he votes, he comes out, and I said, well, did you vote Conservative? And he said, yes, I voted for the damn Conservatives. We have to get rid of the minority government. And I remember that. And over the years, I attend, even as young as 12, 13, I remember going to all candidates debates, watching the Kennedy-Nixon debates on television. It was just something that I was interested in. I mean, my family couldn't understand it because nobody in my family had ever been involved in politics. My friends all thought I was absolutely crazy. But it was just something that I had an interest in. Some people are really interested in music or art or whatever. It was just politics for me. And I never had any interest in running. I just enjoyed the process of politics.
What are the few highs and lows you've seen in politics?
Well, I think the most gratifying thing is when you win and you're not supposed to. And the one that comes to mind for me was in 1995 in Ontario when Mike Harris was running his Common Sense Revolution. And I was the campaign manager, the first time I'd been a campaign manager for Janet Ecker, who went on to serve in the Harris government as she Minister of Community and Social Services, Minister of Education, Minister of Finance. But this was the first time that Janet was a candidate out in Durham West, which was Pickering Ajax, and I was her campaign manager. And we were up against a very prominent local politician for the Liberals. And at the beginning of that campaign, Harris and the Progressive Conservative Party were way back in third place in the polls. And as that campaign went on, you could just see at the door that things were turning. People liked the message. And we ended up winning. Harris won a huge majority, and Janet won a massive victory in Durham West. And that was not supposed to happen. So, I mean, that has to be the highlight of my political life. The worst part, at least in terms of the most depressing, was in 1993 when Kim Campbell had taken over as leader of the Conservative Party from Brian Mulroney. And I think Kim could have been a really good prime minister, but there was just too much baggage from the Mulroney years that it was just it was a disaster, and we ended up with 2 seats. And within a week of the election, Second City in Toronto, their new show was Tory, Party of Two. And I think that pretty well summed it up. But I mean, it was embarrassing for people that had belonged to the party. It was depressing to lose by that much, and I think that was probably the low. This recent election was very, very disappointing as well, because working for a really high quality candidate like Maureen Hartwell in Don Valley East. I mean, Maureen has the background in business. She's got the political background. She's got the pedigree. I mean, her cousin was Jim Flaherty, the former finance minister, and Maureen was by far the best candidate in that riding. And I think we ran a great campaign, one of the best that I've ever been involved in. But when there's a red tsunami coming at you through no fault of your own, there's nothing you can do about that. You're going down along with everybody else. And that's the depressing part of it, because they say that the local candidate, no matter how good they are, and the local campaign, no matter how well it's run, at most accounts for between 5 and 10% of the final vote. Well, that's not much. So when you get in a campaign where, let's say the winner gets 25,000 votes, the most that that candidate actually contributed to was maybe 1,500 to 2,000. And the rest of it was all the result of the leader, the national party, the party brand, the media coverage. And that is the frustrating part of politics. So I've told you what was my best memory, my worst memory, and then probably my most frustrating memory.
No, it was such a good opportunity to sit with you here, John, and talk about politics, talk about highs and lows of politics and strategy. Thank you very much for watching Power Dilemmas here with Sarah Bokhari. Canada has stepped into a new era, actually, where it's going to be redefining its role, and let's see what comes next. Thank you very much again. Till next time.